This morning I'm talking to Clare Brogan, who works for theIDLgroup and specialises in forest governance. She's been closely involved in the EU FLEGT initiative and supporting voluntary partnership agreements in Ghana and Liberia. Between 2002 and 2004, she was seconded into the Forestry Commission in Ghana. I'll be discussing with her her experiences in Ghana, where there's been a history of very weak governance in the forest sector, but there does now appear to be an opportunity for change. Clare will be telling the story through the lens of political economy analysis. Thank you very much for joining us on Capacity for Devs, Clare.
Hi, Gareth.
To start off, could you give us a very quick background on forest management and governance in Ghana? How have forests been managed over the past few decades, and what have been the environmental and economic effects of this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like you said in the introduction, I had spent 2 years seconded into the Ghana Forestry Commission between 2002 and 2004. And when I arrived, it was pretty impressive, the level of sort of professionalism within the Forestry Commission and the staff of the Commission. And what was surprising, given that, was that to hear that Ghana had lost 90% of its forest cover in the previous 50 years, and that between 1990 and the early 2000s, 26% of Ghana's forest cover had disappeared. So I think what sort of the situation, if you like, in 2002 when I arrived in Ghana was that it was one of sort of poor forest management. And despite good forest practices, and I think Ghana and the Forestry Commission in Ghana in particular are quite proud of the fact that within the region they consider themselves to have some of the best laws and policies. They certainly have sort of forestry commission staff that are well trained and certainly capable of managing the resource. And yet the reality on the ground is that there were high levels of illegal logging and allegations of corruption.
So from your insider perspective of having worked within the Forestry Commission in Ghana, what's your explanation of the weaknesses in forest management and governance? Thinking particularly about the role of powerful stakeholder groups, their interests, and how they were making profits from the sector.
Yeah, I think at the time there was a lot of frustration within sort of colleagues at the Commission. The sense of professionalism that people had held, being a staff member of the Forestry Department or the now sort of Forestry Commission, had been lost, and that particularly that had been eroded during the 1990s. And when I arrived in 2000, we were then at that point just 2 years beyond the first democratic transfer of power from one government to another. And so what was interesting in the first couple of years after the elections in 2000, when Rawlings had sort of passed power to Kufuor, was that there was a lot of trouble, I think, and sort of discussion within the press and certainly within the Forestry Commission about a number of timber companies who had backed the wrong horse, if you like, during the elections. And I think what was coming across clearly was, for me, was this sense that companies in the forestry sector in Ghana who perhaps had thought that by providing support to certain political parties they would have access to certain timber concessions. And I think so that level of power and that relationship that existed between the government and the timber sector had been a very damaging one, and that colleagues in the Forestry Commission, like I say, particularly those who were striving to put in place policies of collaborative resource management, I think were finding that they were relatively powerless in terms of the dynamics in the sector.
So what was your impression of what was going on within the forest sector? Was there collusion between regulators and the timber industry? And how was this operating in practice?
I mean, so far, I guess, as my role in working in the Collaborative Resource Management Unit, that wasn't anything that I was directly exposed to. But what I understood was happening was that there would be situations, I think, where there was a sort of a discussion at the time around connivance, what was described as connivance. So I think what they were saying was that essentially there were instances where either rangers at local level or district managers or regional managers or perhaps the chief executive level or higher up were allowing timber companies to get away with practices that they shouldn't have been getting away with. And I think one way that that manifested itself would be around the payment of stumpage fees. And they were really struggling a lot with trying to capture exactly how much revenue was owing, what had been collected. So they were looking at trying to track over time for each forestry district what were the stumpage collection rates and how were they increasing or decreasing. And the actual collection of stumpage and the money owing from timber contractors to the Forestry Commission was something that ultimately became a performance target for district managers. And yet, during reviews of the project, I remember overhearing one of the district managers saying that he felt extremely frustrated that collecting revenue from the timber companies was a target for his performance against which he would be assessed. And yet, he was getting phone calls and instructions from Accra to allow the timber companies to go sort of without paying the revenue that they owed. And so according to the law in Ghana, if a company owes money and hasn't paid that within 30 days, then the Commission is entitled to stop them from operating. And that wasn't happening. And I think the sense certainly within a lot of the middle management at the time was that it wasn't through lack of effort on their part. It was because of political interference and the power, again, that the industry had over the politicians at that level.
So a huge gap between the legal principles and implementation in practice. I understand that you're now more optimistic about the prospects for sustainable forest management in Ghana. So what has changed over the past few years? How have interests and incentives shifted?
Ghana was the first country to engage in the voluntary partnership agreement process. Back in 2005, when the European Union was first thinking about having such agreements, Ghana was one of the first countries to express interest. And the reason it did that was, like I said, they had seen a massive loss of forest cover over the previous 50 years, but particularly an acceleration of that since 1990. Ghana, because they considered themselves within the region, and indeed perhaps within Africa, to sort of be more advanced in terms of value-added processing and tertiary processing. So Ghana had some extremely valuable markets within the European Union. And what they were seeing was that they were concerned that the UK government had a procurement policy since 2000, the year 2000, that required that any procurement officer in UK government would need to be able to ensure that any timber being used in government contracts was coming from verified legal and sustainable sources. And the Ghana Forestry Commission, having an office in London at the time, were seeing the implementation of that policy. By 2004 or 2005, it was very clear to them that they had lost access to the UK government contracts because they were not able to independently verify the legality of their timber. This industry was now at risk of losing a significant market. So in 2005, I think the share of EU market was something like 60% of Ghana's exports were going to the EU. So within Ghana, there was a strong interest in maintaining that market share and a real concern that if markets shifted towards looking for verified legal timber, that Ghana was going to lose out.
So could you tell us a bit about how the VPA process has worked in practice in Ghana? What groups have been involved and how has the process played out?
Certainly. I think the key thing, perhaps, before describing how the process worked was to explain what the expectations were entering into that process. So I think one thing that the European Union and the representatives of the European Commission who led the negotiations from that side were very clear about was that this was not a sort of a one-size-fits-all. This was not, as the Ghanaians were very keen to point out, some stick coming from Europe to beat the Ghanaians. They were very clear that this was something that was going to be entered into voluntarily. There would be an absolute respect of sovereignty. There would be a definition of legal timber that would be based on the existing laws of the country and not a definition that the European Commission would come and bring and say this is what we consider to be legal timber. There was an acceptance as well that across different countries there would be different definitions. But what the European Commission were very clear about was that what we need to see, the only thing we ask, we will respect sovereignty, but what we need to see is that that definition has the support of your different stakeholder groups. So we need to know that whatever definition the government of Ghana negotiating team puts forward, that behind that there is a consensus, so that we don't start trying to, if you like, sort of put timber, legal timber out on the international market and within the EU, where you've got civil society groups in Ghana linking with civil society groups in Europe saying this timber does not respect the rights of local communities. So that, I think that message was very clear. And really, that was sort of put to the test, I think, during the first negotiation that was held in Ghana back in 2007. Ghana really was a country at that point where civil society engagement, government was quite open to consulting with civil society, but what they considered to be consultation and what civil society expected were two different things. So the government were happy to invite civil society to workshops. They were happy to create multi-stakeholder steering committees. And what happened in the first negotiation session was that essentially civil society wrote to the ministry at the time and the head of the EU delegation in Ghana and said, look, we appreciate that this is a process in which you want to see some consensus position. And we acknowledge that the government have done this, this, and this to put in place the institutions, to invite us to meetings, but this is not what we expect in terms of consultation. We're not seeing that we're influencing the outcome of discussions. And so what they wanted was to be able to really sort of sit at the table and negotiate positions and not just be sort of consulted and shown documents as they evolved. And so the response at the time of the European Commission was to say to Ghana, okay, well then the roadmap that we're agreeing for these negotiations perhaps needs to be adjusted and you allow more time for your internal consultations. And for me, I think that was a key turning point, if you like, in the way that the process evolved. Because what it did was it gave civil society in Ghana a real confidence in that, okay, this is not just another one of those processes where they say they're looking for consultations and somebody offers up a participants list from a workshop. This is really an opportunity for us to influence the definition of legality. And so for civil society, like we were discussing earlier, really Ghana, it wasn't a problem with what they had on paper, it was a problem with what happened in practice. And so Ghana's legal framework essentially is relatively strong. And so there were lots of opportunities for civil society to be able to identify laws relating to farmers' right to refuse permission, farmers' right to compensation for crop damage, farmers' right to their share of revenues, and also opportunities perhaps for looking at areas where there was ambiguity or where they considered that rights needed to be strengthened and putting that also in the agreement as something that the government would commit to addressing in the near future. So I think that process of really sort of making it clear with the government that this is not an agreement that's going to be negotiated only between the government and the European Union. It requires a consensus, meant that you suddenly had a situation where you had the private sector sitting at the same table as civil society, at the same table as government, and trying to work out and agree consensus positions on a range of issues.
Stepping back a bit from the details of the VPA process, I wonder if you could highlight for us what really stands out from this case study about how external actors can engage in a situation of weak governance and what it takes to turn that situation around.
Yeah, I think in Ghana, I think that's the case. I think in Ghana at the time when the concept of the VPA was developed and when countries were understanding a little bit more about what this might entail, if you like, there were a lot of things for Ghana in terms of incentives. Although they did a careful analysis of the risks of entering into an agreement, that although voluntary to enter into it, once they had signed up, it would be legally binding. Ghana also had, there was quite a number of reasons why they should enter into it, and the balance clearly came down in favor of entering into it. So you had a situation where they had valuable markets for export of tertiary products to the EU. At the time, like I said, 60% of what they were exporting was going to the EU. They also had a growing market share in the US, and at the time the US was talking about changing legislation requiring proof of legality. And I think their experience with the UK government procurement policy had indicated that perhaps what these documents, that, if you like, and commitments were saying back in 2005 may actually come to fruition, I think. So they also had a little bit of foresight. I think as well they had in Ghana, they had an extremely competent and professional forestry commission. So once it was a decision, if you like, at some level was taken to turn things around, the staff were there with the training, with the skills to be able to help to do that. You had a strong and active civil society, and I think once the European Union demonstrated that it was serious about wanting to see that consensus position, then you had a civil society who were able to take the space at the table that they were given. And really, I think what happened in that period was in the years before the negotiations began, there was quite an antagonistic relationship between government and civil society. And yet through the VPA negotiation process, that engagement became constructive and that relationship changed. And I think the government began to realize that actually within civil society there were a number of individuals who had some very good ideas that they were prepared to consider and to take on board and to reflect in the text of the agreement and in the annexes to the agreement. So I think, if anything, I mean, from my perspective, what I think was key was this idea of the sort of the bargaining, if you like, between the different groups, the ability by providing civil society and other stakeholders the ability to sort of have the negotiating power. I think that's perhaps key. What I think the VPA was able to do was to increase the bargaining power of certain groups that previously had been, if you like, marginalised, like the civil society group, and be able to strengthen that bargaining power that they had to influence discussions in the VPA.
Could you tell us a bit more about the role of external actors and development partners in Ghana? It sounds to me as if they play their hand quite cleverly, devising an instrument that helps to facilitate local processes of bargaining and negotiation, while also bringing in incentives from the international level and trade with Europe and so forth.
I think it's interesting that you describe the process of local bargaining. I mean, one of the lead negotiators for the Ghana team, in a sort of a training video for the countries on how to manage stakeholder processes for VPA negotiations, he made a comment that I thought was really interesting. He said that the government of Ghana quickly learned that it wasn't just about managing international negotiations, it was also about managing negotiations at the national level. So I think you're right that the sort of the process of managing the bargaining between local stakeholders was there, but also the government of Ghana were very keenly aware that they were in an international negotiation. And I think what was interesting for me about that was that, having had the time seconded into the Forestry Commission, where I had seen a sort of a change in language from talking about sort of institutions like the European Commission as being donors to talking about them as development partners. But really, in terms of behaviour and certainly the perception from the government side, there didn't seem to be much difference. So there was an evolution of language without really, from what I could see, or at least from I think the government's perspective at the time, not really a change in behaviour. And what was brought about, I think, by the VPA negotiations was truly, from the government of Ghana's side, was a sense of ownership over that process and an ability to really bargain and negotiate with these development partners or donors, if you like, on an equal footing. And so I think the consequence of that was perhaps we had an agreement from Ghana that maybe could have been sort of a stronger agreement, and the text could have been better in certain parts had it not been a document over which there was genuine negotiation. But what I think was key in that was that we had a situation where the negotiations in Ghana were concluded in September 2008. Just a few months later, we had a change of power. And we had a change of power, I think, by one of the smallest sort of majorities, something like 1% or less. And we had a transition from one part to the other. And so what it meant was that when the first time that the EU sat down with the government of Ghana to look at the agreement and to begin monitoring the implementation of the agreement, essentially they were sitting across the table from a whole different cast of characters. Something like perhaps 80% of the representatives on the Ghana side were now different characters. And I think what was really interesting was that there was absolute ownership for that document. And one of the key sort of technical advisors to the minister from the government of Ghana actually made a comment after the meeting, which I thought was really interesting. And he said, whatever I think about that document and its level of ambition, and he said, and certainly it's ambitious in terms of what it sets, out as objectives for Ghana to achieve. He said, I can't deny that it's our document. And I think that for me, I think, is really a key lesson, that when governments actually feel like their bargaining power, and so not just having a process that can change the bargaining power of the actors at the national level, but when the government felt that its bargaining power had changed with its development partner, if you like, then you had a process that could yield a document for which there was, and set out commitments, if you like, for reform of a sector that has in the past been so difficult to make progress in, that you could have a situation where you have a document over which there is considerable ownership and which provides huge potential for actually making progress with this reform agenda.
Claire, thank you very much for sharing such a rich and interesting story with us. I think there are plenty of lessons there for how donors should engage in supporting governance in particular sectors. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.